And we're live. Welcome back to Casually Hardcore's Guild Master series. This is Marcus, former GM of Gods Among Legends and current GM of, Gods Among Legends US Sargeras, joined today by Hanzo, former Guild Master of Descendants of Draenor from US Deathwing. Hanzo, how you doing, buddy?
Good. Yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. This week's Guild Master series is going to be about, probably the most controversial aspect of World of Warcraft in terms of running a guild, loot.
My favorite.
Yes. So the first part that we're going to talk about is let's talk about loot systems and how they work in pretty much most guilds that are somewhat organized. Talk to us about the pros and cons. Like, first, briefly describe your experience with DKP and talk to us about the pros and the cons of that system.
When we first started raiding back in vanilla, we adopted a fixed price, zero DKP bidding system, and this was based off of EJ at the time. So they had basically priced out every single item. They knew exactly what the value of every particular drop was. And they've done this exercise through kind of a mutual discussion, right? And it's because the itemization was very, very poor back in the day. There were all kinds of bizarre items with strange agility on weapons you would normally see strength on, and it was clear that items just they weren't really tweaked for raiding purposes. I think a lot of them were, but some were more like gimmicky, or they were just throwing things together for whatever reasons. Who knows what their reasons were? More than likely, Blizzard was just learning. I mean, they were going along and felt the need to just throw some random items out there. And not all of them had application in raids. So EJ took this exercise on and spent all this time in a spreadsheet and added all these prices to these items. So then they handled zero-sum DKP, basically like most zero-sum DKP systems. People run raids. Every time loot drops, they took bids based off of the particular price that had been previously set on an item, and whoever it was that had the highest bid and had the DKP allegedly would get the item. So it kind of sounds like it was a bidding system, but really it was whoever was next in line. I mean, that was really how they were distributing loot. They were, continually growing the raid's strength over time. And that's what we adopted. And it worked very well, except for the fact that it was heavy administration. Every new patch, we had to go through all the loot tables, figure out what are the prices, what are the values. It was a lot of overhead. And then, of course, you would have disagreements, right? You would have people, talked a little bit about this in our previous interview chat. Some people were there maybe not for raiding, but for other purposes, such as PvP. So they didn't really agree with the pricing. They didn't feel like, just because they were next in line, didn't really want that, whatever mage bracers or whatever it happened to be. So there were some pitfalls, obviously, with fixed prices. A lot of overhead, a lot of administration, trying to determine prices, and you're going to have people not agree with you. So that was what we had in vanilla. That's basically the start of that.
Briefly describe DKP for someone that has no clue what it is.
So DKP stands for Dragon Kill Points. Came around about the time that EverQuest was rising to power, and it was basically a monetary system. Monetary they used to describe how it was to help track people's contributions to the guild and raid over time. So the more raiding you do, the larger this pool of this ephemeral number value grew, and then you could turn around and bid, spend it, very much like a currency, get the upgrades that you needed. It was a good way for guild leaders to track progression and to track contribution over time, which is essential for hardcore guilds, especially ones that had lots and lots and lots of members. It's very easy to lose track of who was here when and who is really next in line for this particular sword, and I don't really want to make a judgment call, or I'm going to make a mistake. This was all a numbers game. It was basically a numbers version of round robin.
Now, you go in depth on how you explained your DKP system in one of your articles. I think it was 3.8 It was for Wrath. You were changing the system for Wrath.
Hmm.
And a lot of your officers were very concerned about this.
Yeah.
What would you say was the core concern about you kind of modifying your DKP system?
The concern, I think, initially that the guild had was that it would be exploited. And the change that you're more than likely speaking to is the change to add in first round bids.
Yes.
So it's something that I introduced in Wrath, which basically allowed us to tier or break out the ranks in a sort of a hierarchical format, wherein which we had raiders that were lower on the totem pole and weren't really expected at every raid, and maybe weren't the greatest, sharpest, knives in the shed. There certainly were quite a few great raiders, but just ultimately could not commit to a regular raiding schedule. Now, the other end of that was the elites, the people that were basically those hardcore players there every week, every night, signed up early, first people online, had their flasks, had their food ready to rocking the meters. Those guys, those long-termers that were there at every raid, I felt were going to be the longest-term folks. And so I wanted to make sure that we nipped an issue in the bud that we experienced a lot of in the Burning Crusade, which is, I'm going to loot a bunch of items, and I'm going to leave your guild. That doesn't help raid progression. It doesn't help it at all. It's very selfish. So what I wanted to do is for those long-termers that had really earned, they kind of got that tenure building and holding stable, we wanted to give them a little extra perk. So we gave them the ability to first round, which was basically, you guys get to bid before the rest of the raid does. And I encouraged and compelled them to utilize that only when necessary. And that was essentially the most powerful items in the game. We didn't want them to be looted off to people that would be gone next week, or that potentially had the risk of being gone next week.
So what would you say was the best thing about DKP?
The best thing about it is there were no arguments as to where people stood in line. Like, you gave this item to the wrong person, or how dare you choose this guy over me, or there was none of that. All of that, drama was washed away. There was a web-based chart. You look it up. Here's your contribution level. This is what you've earned. You can spend this amount on whatever you want, and that's that. So that's really the best win. It's impartial. It's fair. It plays to the strengths of having to deal with a very large guild and dealing with many faces, some of which that come and go all the time.
And what would you say is the worst thing about DKP?
The worst thing about DKP is that in the minds of the people that are earning it, very quickly becomes associated with a currency, like it's a wage that they've earned, that they feel entitled to spend or save however they wish. When in actuality, you're using it as a mechanism to help administrate raid progression, right? The overall strength of the raid as it grows over time, slowly but surely, people's stamina goes up, people's damage starts to shoot up, they start to have a better healing throughput, all from upgrades. If people feel like they're going to sit on those hard earnings like it's a pool of cash, and I'm just going to wait for the big spend, I'm waiting for that one awesome item, you're not helping the raid, you're not improving at all. You're staying exactly where you are. And this is where the whole loot paradox issue comes into play.
Now, I'll briefly discuss Loot Council. I don't know if you've ever used one, but I tried to use one. It lasted about a whole month. Basically, what Loot Council is it was explained to me by a gentleman who runs Dark Resolve, and he basically said that he enjoyed Loot Council only because he thought next fight long term. Case in point, he showed me an example of how the best melee plate DPS trinket dropped off of a boss called Thok the Bloodthirsty. So he said that he had to make sure that he gave that trinket to his best plate DPSer, because the next fight, the toughest DPS check in the instance was the Siegecrafter Blackfuse conveyor belt team system.
Right.
So he felt that because of situations like that, like if an item dropped that a healer and a caster could use, if the next fight was more healing intensive, he would give it to the healer because he was always thinking ahead.
Mhm.
So it's basically just a council of people that decide, okay, this person gets loot, and it's under guidelines that are set by the guild. I ran a loot council based off of informal DKP in a sense, where I tracked people's attendance, I tracked people's performance, I tracked the next fight. It was all coming into play, and most of my decisions were pretty cut and dry, even in a 25-man raid. Talk to
Mhm.
us about your opinion on loot council.
Oh boy, Luke Council. Pretty opinionated in this department, and only because I hate it more than life itself. I don't like Luke Council because I think that it's too easy to corrupt. Emotions flare, tensions get high. Your best buddy is in the raid, and he suddenly pisses you off, but he was next in line for a particular weapon, and since you're an officer, you decide it's going to go to someone else. Look, we've all had these moments where we get pissed off, upset, affected by emotions, affected by stuff even outside of WoW, and we make bad judgment calls. That's the problem right there. It is related, it's entirely dependent on judgment calls, and that means it's based on your opinion, what you think is right or wrong. And what my opinion is not necessarily what everyone else's opinion is. And that can change from day to day. I'd really much rather have a numbers-based game reflect their contribution over time and use that as a measure to quantify where they are in the position to get loot. Now, Loot Council, I do think, does have its place, especially in smaller guilds that don't really want to worry about a lot of administration. And this is a key piece, I think Loot Council works well in guilds where the people know themselves so well, they might have to face each other in real life the next day. You know, maybe you got a little 10-man group going from people that you work with. It just happens they're all playing WoW. Well, if you screw one another over in loot, you're going to have to face that person at work the next day. Maybe a little bit less likely to screw them over. So in that case, Loot Council, it does work for very small, tight-knit groups where there's a mutual understanding and trust, and there's accountability is enforced in real life. You know, having to face them.
Now, the other two ways that, well, there's actually three more, but two of them are very similar. One of them is the random roll one loot per boss rule, where players just roll if they can use it. What do you think of that system?
Mm. It's, I guess it's a perfectly fine and fair system as long as you're not looking to progress, because it doesn't really keep track of anything. You know, to speak to your buddy's issue about the DPS being first in the list, you know, I would have to argue with that and say I think tank, effective health, survivability is first, following healers, following that. DPS is at the end. So already we have a difference of opinion there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, anyway, I don't want to go down the Loot Council path anymore. But yeah, random rolls, it's good for a quick little, hey, we're going to get this together, let's put this quickly together. No one really needs any upgrades or whatever, let's just do this, right? And if the loot is throwaway, sure, that's fine. But if you're looking for, they're putting investment into their character long term, random is not a good idea.
Now, what do you think of Suicide Kings?
Now, I had limited experience with Suicide Kings, only through some colleagues, friends of mine that I worked with that used it in their guilds. And it seems like it's more of a numbers-based game from a position standpoint, where who's next in line to get an item. And I like the sound of that, especially if it continues to convey that the focus isn't on you and you getting good. The focus is on the raid and the overall strength of the raid growing. And any loot system that plays to that continues to, like, you're next in line, this is your position in line, here's where you go, and you know, you're logically the next one up for the overall growth of the guild. Yeah, I'm for that, absolutely.
Now, let's briefly talk about the new loot system that's been making waves the last maybe couple years, is EPGP, Effort Points, Gear Points. It's kind of a hybrid system between DKP and Loot Council.
Hmm.
Or it's basically I was in a couple of guilds that they used EPGP, and basically, like for instance, I'll use the Black Fuse thing. The DPSers that did belts got 10 extra EPGP because they were doing belts.
Hmm.
The tanks didn't necessarily need EPGP if they were two tanks of different things. It was more of like a loot council for them. But what do you think of that hybrid system where you're giving everybody DKP, but you're also opening yourself up an opportunity to give somebody a little bit more if you feel like they're putting in more effort?
Who gets to decide whether or not they're putting in more effort? The people running the raid?
Yep.
And,
The officers do.
and everybody knows that up front?
Yep.
Okay. I guess it sounds good in theory, but I'm a little concerned about, once you open that up to, well, there's also a little bit of room to make some judgment calls. I mean, look, I had a very, very cut and dried, written down on paper set of very strict rules. And even today, I'll have people that I don't particularly see eye to eye with after the guild all collapsed that believe that I still found ways to manipulate it. A hard and fast, these are the rules, this is how loot's distributed, this is how you measure what you have earned and how you spend. They still think that I left it open to interpret, that I made judgment calls. So the more your loot system allows for openings for certain people to be treated certain ways, and you don't very, very carefully scrutinize those loopholes, you're going to have a problem eventually. Maybe not tonight's raid, maybe not tomorrow. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would have to also ask, who does this work best for? Are we talking about a long-term casual or casual hardcore or hardcore guild, or are we talking about we kind of pick people up at random every week, and this is the most efficient way to run a loot system for them, to mix in strangers on a weekly basis? I'd have to know the audience as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're pretty much in agreement where we think DKP is probably best suited for more organized semi-hardcore, hardcore guilds, while the Loot Council seems to fit the more casual, tight-knit groups, and the other systems are pretty much for just, whatever works for you.
Ostensibly, there are hardcore, small, tight-knit groups, too, as we saw with the rise of the 10 men at the end of Wrath and all throughout Cataclysm, so certainly would work for them, too, again, if they have that mutual respect and understanding. If there are 10 people that are complete strangers that think they know each other, I would suggest otherwise.
Now, talk to us about your article. This next part, I actually had it set as loot drama, loot whores. But when I came across your article this morning, I'm kind of shifting gears here. Talk to us about 3.5, the article about loot, and briefly describe that whole chart, because it was absolutely brilliant.
Loot paradox. Okay, so in that post, the theory that I pose is that raiders continually confuse what their end goal is. Why are they raiding, right? And I think that the genuinely true hardcore raiding ones, server first, world first, they know exactly why they're doing it. They're doing it for conquest, for the bragging rights, for the achievement, for the ability to put their hand up in the sky and wave and say, guess what, nerds? We were the first ones to do it. So they already don't even hesitate for a moment when are asked the question, how do you deal with loot? Loot is distributed purely through the most efficient manner to get the raid up as fast as possible, raiding in an effective manner. So, tanks with their effective health, healing with heals and throughput, DPS at the tail end of that. For the many, many other guilds out there who love the shiny swords and the fancy shields and all kinds of magical staves, some of them might not necessarily have a full grasp of why it is that they're raiding. They may say they're doing it, for the journey, but really they want to get their hands on the fat loots. And any raid or raiding guild that has a problem keeping, fantasy from reality, if you'll pardon the pun, separate, and continue to look at loot as the reason why they're doing it, they're going to struggle. They're going to hit obstacles, they're going to wipe, and they're going to run back. and they're going to wipe and run back again. And they're going to wipe and they're going to run back. And tempers are going to flare, and they're going to start pointing fingers and going, we can't do this, boss, yet, because we don't have the gear necessary. We need to farm more. Okay, all right, we hear you. So let's go back and farm, right? They see it as the tool. They see it as the tool necessary to fix the problem. So they go back and they try and figure it all out, and they slowly work through the problems. They slowly work through the issues, and they're blaming each other, and eventually they have that epiphany, right? They get over the boss, or they do research. They figure it out, and they go, oh, you know what? It actually wasn't loot at all. It wasn't loot that was preventing us. We just needed to, get our, for lack of a better word, shit together. Loot is just a tool to help us get there, right? But ultimately it was our skill. It was preventing us from getting over that. So once they hit this epiphany, they're just moving and grooving, man. They're raiding, they're killing bosses, they're knocking shit out. They're just doing great. They're doing great. And at this point, they fully embrace that it's a tool. They fully embrace it. We're here to raid, we're here to journey, we're here to wave our hands and say it's a great success. It's just the loot. That just helps us get there, right? But really, we're here for the raid. We're here for the journey and the experience until they hit that next obstacle. All of a sudden, brick wall again. Can't kill the boss. Can't kill it. Wiping, running back, and they start blaming one another again. We can't get over this boss because we need the gear. Okay. So do you see how this is a kind of a vicious cycle over and over again, right? They wipe, they blame each other because all they really want is the loot, not focused in on what they need to be fixing. Stop standing in the fire. Start taking responsibility for your own player. Take a little bit of pride in what you do. Oh, you killed the boss. Oh, look at that. Look at that. It was all in you and your skill and your ability to execute, right? So they stop focusing on loot as a reward. Now it's a tool again, right? And so they get their successes and it repeats. It's a constant problem. And if raid leaders and guild leaders don't acknowledge it, it continues to cycle like that. They'll continue to go through those cycles, and they'll eventually hit one wall where the tempers flare and people will start walking away. You can't have that. You have to solve it before you get into that cycle and it falls apart.
And I think it was very brilliant that you kind of set it up that way. Was pretty much every time that my guild killed a heroic boss, it wasn't because of loot. It wasn't because we were under-geared. The one thing that I did to try to explain to my guild, and we actually talked about this before, was I'm currently on WoW Progress, and I'm looking up the average item level for the world first heroic 25-man garage kill. Their average item level was 566. And I'm looking at some of my ex-guildies who have yet to kill heroic garage. They haven't even gotten close, and they're in the 580s.
Yeah.
So, but I think
and
you're
what's
right.
The first thing they say? They go to you and they say, "Yeah, we're not ready for this, Marcus. We need to go back, get just a little bit more gear, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Then we'll be good." And you're looking at this chart going, "But they've been doing it practically in greens. Well, we don't need any more gear. We need to fix other much larger problems."
Pardon the cliche, but learn to play.
Right, exactly. Tell me how to play. I just need new weapons.
and that was the funny thing was I had rock hard data, but you mentioned this before in a previous podcast where you said no matter what data you throw at them, they're already stuck in their mind, the Dunning-Kruger effect. They're already stuck in that mindset where, oh no, we need the gear, we need the gear. It can't be done without gear. Gear.
Yeah, it just cycles.
It's a vicious cycle, and I just found it funny that we accomplished so much, and then when we couldn't kill the same bosses we were already killing on 10-man, it was all about loot again. But talk to us about the causes of and the remedy of loot drama and or loot whores.
Well, in this particular instance, the solution to how do you break out of the vicious cycle, right, of the loot paradox? I hate to say it, and it's going to ruffle a few feathers, but you have to have a raid leader that isn't afraid to say, we're done farming. It's time to move forward, right? They have the best ability tools to oversee the raid. across the board see the big picture beyond the scope of just the rogue or just the mage or just the priest. They know what the raid is doing DPS wise, HPS wise. They should be charged with the responsibility of saying, we're going to get to level X in terms of DPS or HPS or whatever they feel that the gauge should be, and then you're done farming. It's time to move forward. A lot of people are not going to like to hear that because, again, they're going to go back to, I really wanted this one sword. Well, that's great. I mean, and, a buddy of mine in EJ, Zoid, told me, never count on loot. It's never a guarantee, right? That harkens back to vanilla when really there was only one way to get it. It came off of bosses. It was a completely, random loot is random. So I tried to encourage them to pretend that you're never going to see another upgrade again and maximize what you have on you to the fullest. Once you've done that, gemmed it, enchanted it, reforged it, whatever you need to do, that's when you can put it out of your mind and aside and get down to the business of the real issues. Why are you messing up as a player? You've taken care of the loot. That's we're done there. We're good. Now let's focus in on you and how you need to improve.
Now let's talk about loot changes and how they've affected the game. The first thing that I do want to talk about is the epics most of the loot changes I would say happened around Wrath of the Lich King. With the basically, if you killed a heroic 5-man dungeon, each one dropped a table of epics, so you could get a pretty good set of epic gear just from doing heroic 5-mans.
Yep.
Then they came out with the Conquest and Valor Point system in Wrath.
Sure.
Then they came out with the Frost Badge system, which enabled players to get a whole tier set of gear simply by doing badges, and also the heroic dungeons of Trial of the Champion and the 3.3 dungeons, which all dropped epic loot.
Yep.
Talk to us about how that affected the game in terms of how players perceived loot as epics were given away in a sense.
Yeah, I remember. What do they call them? Welfare epics.
Yeah, welfare epics.
Yeah. I mean, again, let's call a spade a spade. They were what they were. They served a purpose, and the purpose was it filled a gap that we needed as far back as pre-Sunwell. So they only began to start solving the problem when the Sunwell came out, which was basically as follows. You run a hardcore raiding guild, you're trying to make progression, you're doing great, life happens. You lose your main tank. Okay, so that means you go back to Serpentine Cavern and start all over again? No, that was a year and a half ago. We got to keep rolling. Life happens, and we're not all professional, gaming guilds that are sponsored by Razer, Some of us have real lives, and we're going to lose people, or they're going to dump out. But there was no way to fill gaps other than to raid. So this whole Valor Justice Badge system, Honor Badge, and Emblems of Frost, I think they were back in Wrath of the Lich King, they help serve a very real purpose, a very real need. People need to be gapped in, right? You need to bring in brand new people halfway through an expansion, or even at the end of an expansion. Expect them to start all the way at the beginning of raiding and go from there. Sometimes you need to have alternate ways of getting stuff. And I think Blizzard did a pretty reasonable job at gating even that. I mean, you still had to do some stuff, but it was doable. You could do it in a reasonable amount of time. And I always got a chuckle out of people that continue to say, this is bullshit, I can't believe I have to earn all this rep first and all these badges. Look, do you want everything handed to you on a platter? I mean, it wasn't just that long ago that you had to start from scratch, back to the beginning of the line. We're just about ready to wrap up Illidan. Back to Serpentine Cavern or whatever. It's just, come on.
I'm actually a big fan of the Wrath catch-up system because you had to do heroic 5-mans to get the loot. The loot wasn't that great. There wasn't really anything best in slot. It was just to get you. It was just to give you an opportunity.
It was a stopgap.
Yeah, it was to give you a chance. So I'm all for that. But what I think Wrath of the Lich King did was it made players accustomed to epics coming pretty easily. Not necessarily easily, but purples were coming your way often. If you did the Wrath 5-mans, purples were coming your way. So then they go into a raid and they say, well, heroic 5-man dungeon wasn't that hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trial of the Grand Crusader should give me some. I should walk into ICC. We should be killing these bosses and just keep the purples coming. Keep the
Yeah,
purples
keep them
coming.
coming. I'll never forget the first day that they started to shift gears in that too, because I remember back when we were in vanilla, the only way to get epics, the only way to get an epic was raiding, and there were a very few exceptions, and whatever exceptions there were, like a random staff here or some sort of a strange amulet out of Skullman's there, they weren't even mentionable. Even in ZG20 Man back in vanilla, it was mostly blues. Right? I think maybe epics came off of Hakar at the very end, and I remember through several patches, they just started to slowly upgrade the blues. Like I remember some of the ZG sets, they were blues originally, and then we logged on one day, and then they were epics, and it was like, whoa, 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 epics only come from the Molten Core and beyond. What's this junk? They were on the way, man, on the way. Now, of course, the epics rain down from the sky.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would probably say the epics rain down from the sky mostly in Wrath, and I think that conditioned players to think that, well, epics should just always come from the sky, and
Yeah.
I shouldn't have to wipe 20 times on the boss. I'm used to the bosses dying fast.
Yeah. Effort versus reward was diminished. Certainly.
And moving on to Cataclysm, we've gone in depth with the 10 and 25 loot changes. And also the LFR changes. Briefly describe how that affected the game, both early on Cataclysm and then towards the end with LFR.
Boy, oh boy. So you want to know specifically how loot changed in Cata and
Well,
the game.
how it affected players in terms of their perception of loot.
Oh boy. Okay. So we're gonna go into theory territory for me. A lot of this is opinion, and this is based off of just my own empirical evidence. This is just what I saw happening. So I saw continual marginalization of the differences in the various levels of gear. Right? So we went from gear that went in Molten Core, that dropped out of Molten Core and Blackwing Lair, to, I can use that gear and pretty much kill anybody I want, Alterac Valley or wherever, to pieces of gear in Cataclysm where visually they didn't even really look all that different, other than maybe a little bit of a palette swap. And eye level wise, of course, they were exactly the same. The 10 and the 25 were exactly the same. When LFR rolled around at the beginning of Dragon Soul, just a slight difference. Just a slight difference. Where did that come into play? It came into play nowhere. You go out into Alterac Valley, and unless you're a professional PvPer, you were pretty much equal. It was all skill-based. And don't get me wrong, I think that was probably a decision they wanted to go that way, right? They did not. There were early arguments of, this is all about gear. All these guys, they suck, but it's their gear that helps them win. This is such crap. It needs to be skill-based. Well, by the time we got to Cataclysm 8 years later, it was pretty much skill-based. The differences in loot were so minute that it felt like all of the effort that was put in was just washed away. And it probably sounds like I'm a hypocrite here, because we were just talking about the loot paradox a few moments ago. Hanzo, we're not doing it for loot. We're doing it for the journey, for the experience, for the achievement. That's absolutely right. And by the time we got to the end of Cataclysm, the journey was done. It was finished. There was no more enjoyment. There was no more excitement. There was no more reason to continue on. That's ultimately, the reward was not matching the effort. It just was the reverse, right? I had been complaining all along that the casuals were putting in no effort, getting everything. We were putting in tons of effort, seeing nothing. Seeing no turnaround, nothing that made us special. And it sounds elitist to say, but it's a lot of reason why we play these games. We want to have some importance in the game, especially ones that involve a social ladder. You're sitting on a server. You're among many other players. What do you want to make you stand out amongst the others? you're the top PvP guild, or you're the top raiding guild, or you're the greatest with pet battles, or you're the greatest transmoggers. If everyone's the same, with all varying degrees of effort, what's the point?
Mhm. Well, you touch upon a great point, and I actually had this argument with my co-host Monopod. I always said, well, does it really matter to you if you've got this cool mount from Garage and somebody else doesn't? I always put that question out there because a lot of people, they like that. They want to stand out. They want to be different in this world and also in the world of Warcraft.
Right.
And part of that, unfortunately, lately has come through loot. You can buy achievements these days. You can buy them. You can even buy loot too. But a lot of people do value themselves through their item level. The next on the list, of course, is Mists of Pandaria. Now, Mists of Pandaria probably had the most drastic loot changes in one expansion throughout its entire patches. Now, a couple of interesting things happened in Mists of Pandaria. They introduced the Lesser Charms of Good Fortune, which could be to buy coins to coin a boss off, coin loot off the boss. Talk to us briefly how you felt about that system.
Good system, actually. I like that. The whole LFR, they were making some guesses with LFR at the end of Cataclysm, and they clearly made some steps to kind of remedy that a little bit in Mists. I like the tokens. I think it was a great idea. I think it gave people the ability to kind of work it out. Remember, and I've said this in several podcasts that we've had before in interviews, I'm on the side of the fence that says I actually feel that a little bit of effort is important. And I still think I'm in the small minority of that group, because what I continually heard, since we were no longer really a guild or raiding, is that people were saying, these dailies suck, this is a huge time waste, why are you forcing me to do this stuff over and over? Well, they're not being forced. It's an option. If you would like a second chance at loot, and you'd like to burn another one, burn another token on a particular drop because you want to wrap that setup, this is an option for you. Do it or don't. Why do you feel the need to complain about being given that option? And, I think it's just because this is a mentality of the WoW community now. They're very, very good at complaining and not very good at remembering the way it was and being thankful for what they've been given.
Well, talk to us about that daily quest grind that involved reputation and earning valor points. Now, Blizzard's original intent when they announced it at BlizzCon 2011 was the only reason why they added daily rep and valor gear was they wanted people to feel like they could advance their character without having to raid. They wanted and they wanted people out in the world. Well, unfortunately, what Blizzard thinks should happen when they throw something on the table doesn't happen. So if you're in a raid and you just can't get that set of legs, what are you going to do? You're going to grind out Calaxy rep and get those tanking legs.
If you are the mindset that you're like, oh god, I want that item, so then you go and you do it. Or if you're not of that mindset, you complain. And you go on the forums and you bitch about how much effort you have to put into this, and why is Blizzard once again catering to the people that have the most time invested. And to that, again, I call shit on that. Well, you put any amount of effort into anything in life, it's going to take time and practice, and then you're going to get good at it.
It's funny that that you should say that, because I kind of disagree. When I came back to WoW, it was patch 5.0. I hadn't played since Cataclysm had launched. Maybe a few weeks after it launched, I took a break.
Yeah.
When I came back in Mists of Pandaria, I was shocked because I was used to Wrath, where you could catch up and just get that chance to raid.
Sure.
The one thing that I felt that now, even with LFR is not a guarantee. Remember, no loot's a guarantee.
No.
But it felt like I didn't have a chance anymore. It felt like, wow, all I'm relegated to do is, and all I did for the first 5 months of Mists was grind out my dailies and grind out LFR every week.
Right.
I didn't feel like I had a chance. And they remedied that with the Timeless Isle, the whole, world bosses, Celestials, Ordos, things of that nature, the flexible tier, even more tiers of gear. So they remedied their problems, but I would probably say that Mists of Pandaria's launch was probably, in terms of giving raiders a chance, was very poor.
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one. I would have to say, I think that the grind was a little long and not very alt-friendly. However, I'd like to point out that it is still doable. And again, this all boils down to the mentality of the gamer that's sitting behind the keyboard and mouse, right? So if you know that you have to just put in a little bit of time and an effort to get it, you will get it. I'm not going to lie to you. It sucks. There's times when those grinds are not fun at all. They're just dull. They're boring. I mean, even my daughter behind me, who looks like, maybe she's not an LFR now, but she does do LFR quite frequently, and mirrors the same problems that you guys are talking about now. Just want to finish that one piece off. Just want to wrap that up. Another LFR, another failed attempt at getting loot. Back in you go another week, another week, another week, another week. But she has the ability to do that now. Granted, not in a guild, not in a dedicated raiding guild, but has the ability to click that LFR button, and you knew that she had to hit those minimum requirements, the eye level in this case. I think that was a step in the right direction. I don't think eye level in general is a very good gauge of people's skill, because I see all kinds of people in high eye levels that suck. They suck hard. And again, it's not a reflection of their gear. It's a reflection of the mentality. The lull, I don't need to put in effort. I've never had to put in effort. Well, we're actually starting to head back in that direction. It sure looks that way, especially with the stuff that they've announced for Warlords of Draenor. Yeah, I mean, it does look like a little bit of effort is involved, and that's okay. It's okay to put in a little bit of effort. And if you feel otherwise, there's a possibility that WoW just never really was your game. It brought in a lot of people in Wrath, a lot, and of different mindsets and mentalities. And, I just don't think that all of those mentalities mesh with an MMO. If you were to take World of Warcraft today and turn it into EverQuest, circa 1999, I think you would lose a lot of people. Guess what? I'm not a fan of EverQuest. It's one of the most influential. I mean, it is the reason why World of Warcraft is here today. If it wasn't for EverQuest, we sure as hell would not be here with WoW. And that was some real hardcore effort, grinding, long hours into the night. You neglect your family, you neglect your job, you haven't had a shower in several weeks. It's that type of game. It's that type of audience. It's just that it's trying to appeal to a larger audience.
Absolutely. Looking forward into Warlords of Draenor, I'm actually really excited for Warlords, only because we'll be starting the entire expansion from the basically 4 tiers of difficulty.
Yes.
The new raids.
Yeah.
And also, if you remember Ghostcrawler's little spiel at BlizzCon, nobody's happy when the int plate drops except for the Paladin. Well, now, no matter what the gear is, if it's plate, any plate wearer can put those shoulders on, and if he changes specs, they change. If he's a Paladin, they change into intellect shoulders, and if he goes ret or prot, it turns into strength shoulders.
I like that. I think that's a great idea, especially for the classes that are hybrids. Like, I don't know how many alts you have. I've got a couple. My Paladin's bag's full of the max. Tank set, healing set, ret set, PvP. Holy crap, I'm completely out of space. Yeah, maybe rogues and warlocks don't have to worry about that, but other classes do. This is wasteful. Stupid. Just change them. And that's why I always like reforging too. It's going to be kind of crappy that it goes away, but his argument was it's all solved by askmrrobot.com. Well, all right, fine, whatever.
Well, I think that they announced reforging in Cataclysm because players had problems because they couldn't reach hit caps. I remember in Wrath of the Lich King, I was using item level 200 boots from Naxxramas because they had a lot of hit on them.
Exactly.
So they created reforging so that way if you were under or over the hit cap, you can get past the hit and expertise cap. Well, hit and expertise are gone now.
Yep.
So
maybe no need for reforging.
Yeah, so there's no need for reforging. I think Warlords is also going to be good because you can set your guild to a personal loot system, or you can set it to a loot system where if you have X amount of players, X amount of loot drops. Um,
It's pretty cool. I
yeah,
like
it's
that.
actually really good. So with the last about 10 or 15 minutes we have left in the podcast, we have some fan questions. Well,
All right, bring them on. Let's go. Let's do this.
the
Like fan
first
questions.
The first fan question is from one of my dedicated listeners. He goes by Yog Zeron, basically Yog Seron with a Z.
I get
it. How did your guild try to collude for gear in a DKP system?
Ah! So he wants me to tell him the story of the A-Team.
Basically, how they, because he's wondering how they actually
TLDR.
could do it.
Yeah, okay, so here's how it worked. So remember we talked a little bit earlier in the interview about first round bidding. So the way it was set up was that was a perk, right? You're a hardcore raider. You're there every week, without fail. No excuses, no cancellations. You're there. You're top deeps. You're top heels. You're reliant. You've been with us a long time. You've proven your worth and earned your tenure. You earned the ability to first round. So the goal was to only first round bids items that were very, very powerful, very hard to get. We wanted to make sure that they kept in the raid progression team. In the off chance, raiders came and go. That's what they did. They had real life priorities that took over. So one of the 10-man teams in my guild took it upon themselves to first within their own 10-man, because again, I didn't really govern the 10-mans. I didn't say you must use this loot system in your 10-man group. I said, look, as long as you don't do something horrible, please use your common sense. This is the red flag. Don't ever say that. As soon as you say use your common sense, someone's going to exploit it. Find a way to excuse it. You never wrote this down. That's what they did. They initially had a loot system internal to themselves where they were just kind of figuring it out. It was kind of like a loot council. Well, let's say, Breath, what do you need? You need this tanking piece or creation? Or you need this sword? How are we going to do? All right, sure, let's work this out. Over time, they began to develop this mentality of, man, we're the number 1 10-man in the guild. We've actually earned some records on the server. Don't we drive things in this guild? Yeah, we kind of do. We kind of drive everything. We're the reason the 25-man exists. It's us. It's this 10-man. I think we should kind of make sure that we keep that 10-man, keep that best loot that drops in this little group here. So I think we should start leveraging our first bidding, loot rules a little bit more liberally on pretty much everything. Everything that they felt was, as opposed to, please use this with discretion on only the most important items. Fuck it, we'll just use it on everything. We'll use it on whatever. And they were free to do that because the loophole was there was not enough of a cost assigned. I stepped away from that, saying I'm going to try to build a culture and educate you guys on how to loot correctly so that you don't bust the balls of your fellow raiders. Well, they were nodding up and down. Yeah, I get it. I'm educated. I know. Whatever. Here comes that next trinket. Creation, this one's yours. I'll bid next week. So they were burning all their first-round bids. They had tons of DKP because they were elites. They were raiding every week. They geared out, and they were still raiding. So the DKP was piling up and piling up. So they were free to first round as much as they wanted. And they did, to keep that loot amongst themselves. And the raiders that I also wanted to grow and get a little bit of reward for their effort got nothing. They were neglected, cast aside.
Mm-hmm. Now, following that, he also asks, why did your guildies choose to keep loot concerns from you?
Well, I think, I talked to them individually, and I think a lot of it was a combination of things. Shame, pride in their 10-man achievements, peer pressure from each other. They had this, the other loophole of Wrath was that I never really appointed anyone in charge of 10-mans. And there needed to be somebody that could step up and take accountability for those bad decisions. Well, there really was no one. So perhaps, amongst themselves, they felt justified saying, well, there's nobody's really in charge, and wasn't it somebody else's idea to originally start doing this, and that person isn't around anymore, so we'll just fucking do it. We'll just keep doing it. So, I don't think that they were necessarily trying to be evil, but they were finding ways to justify sidestepping rules that I had not explicitly written down. So, food for thought, all those potential guild leaders out there. Anytime you are about to say this, please, guildies, use your common sense. That is going to bite you in the ass. Stop, back up. What you were normally going to say was common sense. Write it down. That's now an official rule. I guarantee if you think someone is going to leverage common sense, they will find a way around it. You didn't tell me I wasn't supposed to make jokes about raping and murdering women. Yeah, it's common sense. Oh, okay. I get it now.
Now, this is a question that I'm posing to you. It's true or false. Gearing up is a single-player game in which you use others to make yourself more powerful.
Oh, Jesus. Boy, oh boy. Not vanilla. I had to rely on other people. I would say, based off of what you and I have discussed tonight, more and more. Absolutely. At least to a starting point, right? To get to... Remember how we talked about how the old instances were gated and you had to do 50 million things in order just to open the door and step through? Well, that gating is gone. And what's in place of it is the eye-level gate, right? You can't go into LFR until you have X, right? So that's the single-player grind. Think about it. I mean, you get stuff from 5-man heroics. Don't need a guild for that. You can do it by yourself. You grind rep out from people like the Claxi and all that other stuff. They don't require a guild. Bringing a guild along would speed things up, but it's not necessary. Anything where it isn't necessary, it's not a requirement. You have to have a group to do X. Otherwise, you don't get it. Yeah, that's ultimately, it turns into a selfish item that has to be completed.
Now, was your score and eye level the catalyst for even more loot whoring that we've been seeing lately?
I think people hyper-focused on it quite frequently. It was a common issue. I mean, I myself fell into the trap as well, especially after getting Shadowmourne and then trying to compete with the likes of top-notch melee in my guild like Junkard and Crasian and Hell Spectral, people like that. It was all about, oh, I've done everything I need to do. This is Dranosh, what's his face, Sorfang. There is no more skill improvement. Now we've rolled back into, it's the only thing that's going to get me above that notch, that's gear, right? Just a little bit more, just one more little tiny bit of an eye level. See what I mean? It's almost like a bell curve, really. When you get to points like that where the boss really requires no skill at all, it's a very, very easy loot pinata, then yeah, those raid bosses, they are all about gear, aren't they?
Yep. And finally, when did loot become a goal rather than a tool? And are people trying to one-up each other by eye level rather than achievement or, world first? Is world first that important or server first that important anymore?
Well, I think what am I doing? I think less. At least up till now, I can't speak about Warlords of Draenor. It's not out yet, but I think up till this point, World First and Server First certainly does not hold the wow factor that it did back in the day. I mean, when we're talking about vanilla, we're talking about very, very few raiding guilds. I mean, there were a good chunk of them. There were hundreds of raiding guilds, but that was still a very, very small percentage compared to who raids today. And man, oh man, the time and effort that went into some of those bosses, I mean, we didn't go quite as far in vanilla as some of those world firsts. I still think we did pretty well. based off of what we had to work with. But man, I can remember spending weeks and weeks and weeks on just one boss. So when you spend that amount of time on a single boss and then you think to yourself, oh shit, this raid's got 10 bosses in it. Yeah, you clear all those bosses, that was for a nerd gamer moment, man, that was something else. It was really that the cheers really deafened you in Vent or TeamSpeak or whatever it was, because oh my god, it was this ginormous hurdle you had finally overcome. And a lot of that is now replaced by a golden banner. Achievement, server first, Conqueror of Noxramas. Well, so what, right? So what, big deal. You and 50,000 other guilds just did it within the first week. The focus was the achievement, and people that knew how to read between the lines and pay attention knew the value of it. They knew, oh wow, hey, look at that one guy, whatever the Titans title. Yeah, they killed, what's his face, and had to, they kept their eye level down to a minimum. Algalon. But that was for the people that paid attention, right? The people that focused in on that. The large masses, they didn't really care. And that grew. That became more of an issue as the user base grew, right? More and more people played, less and less people really gave a shit about that. So what? Big deal that you were the first people on the server to do it. I got my own little crappy PvP guild going over here, and besides, raiding is lame. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's definitely the mentality's changed, I think.
So true or false? Loot is a goal, not a tool.
Oh, loot is absolutely a tool. It gets you where you need to go, and the way in which you answer that question is based on where you're at. So, for example, the one we were just talking about, Sorfang. You are week after week defeating an easy boss, changing nothing because you don't need to change anything. The skill is already there. You're in place. You move and you move. You change targets when you change targets, and now it's all about just pushing that last little notch. Well, that's selfish. That's a personal goal. You're doing that for yourself. For what? Nerd bragging rights. Yay! I was #1 on the damage meters. It does help the guild progress, but you wouldn't have failed without that position, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really a tool. The goal should be the journey. It should be the experience. It should be the excitement of doing it. As long as the excitement and the reward, and you feel satisfaction from completing it, as long as that's intact, you're good to go, right?
So I guess I'll frame this question a second time. The majority of WoW players view loot as a goal rather than a tool.
Majority, yes. Framed that way, the majority of players in WoW absolutely see it as the goal. I'm here for the loot, here for the fat loots. By the way, I'm gonna just stand here in this pit of fire during Megira for 10 seconds. You don't mind, eh? Whoa, it's just a game.
No, I'm gonna end my portion of the podcast with a quote that somebody told me once in ICC. I was full of purples from the dungeons and maybe from TOGC, and I said I can't wait to grind out my frost badges to get the tier, and I can't wait to gear this guy out to see how he's gonna play. And my guildmaster told me, as soon as you gear out that tune, you're gonna be so tired of him, you're never gonna play him again.
Yeah.
So.
Good quote.
Exactly. Now, any final thoughts, Hanzo, before we close this out about loot?
Just keep aware of that. Keep it in the back of your mind at all times. If you're the leader or the officer responsible for handling loot, make sure that you handle it fairly. Make sure that you have all the loopholes tightened up, and the judgment calls. Do your very, very best to kind of keep the judgment calls to a dull roar. Go by numbers, go by contribution, and for God's sakes, if you ever feel like you need to utter the words common sense, it's time to reevaluate your rules.
All right, well, that should do it for this Guildmaster series. Thank you so much, Hanzo, and you can catch Hanzo's blog, 8yearsinazeroth.blogspot.com. Could you give us a sneak peek as to your next article coming out? It's going to be tomorrow, right?
Yeah, it's the same article we talked about last week, actually. This one's going to touch on. I'm trying to decide whether or not I can keep the guild focused on the 25 with the 10s, all doing their own thing. And maybe I'm possibly considering cutting the 10s completely out of the guild. And what would the possible effects of that be? So that's what tomorrow's post is about.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hanzo, and we'll see you next week.
All right, good night.